Have you ever been in this situation? You've just designed the most adorable block. It looks just like a Highland cow, but it's traditionally pieced. The only problem is that it's got like 10,000 friggin' little pieces and steps. So how on earth are you going to write a pattern for this thing that is not completely painful to read? That is the topic of today's Tech Tip Tuesday. Okay, so how do you break down a block like this and make it actually readable for your customer? This is a really great example. This is like a picture piece block. It's an S shape, right? But it's got a lot of pieces and steps to get you there. So for instance, you might start with this top piece. You've got to do like a stitch and flip on that corner and another one on the other corner. And then you do the same thing here with the same rectangles, but you put the corners on in a slightly different method. And then you've got to sew a rectangle and a square together. And those are the same squares as they're in the corner, but there's different steps to put those pieces in. So if you're writing this with traditional methods where you're naming the dimensions every single time you refer to a piece, it just gets out of control very easily. Another great example of this would be something like this, right? So this is a square and a square block, and you start with one square in the middle and you add triangles to each side of it and build out this pretty cool block, to be honest. But you've got 5 pieces of fabric in 4 different colors that you've got to keep track of, and they're all different dimensions. So how do you write a pattern that's actually readable when you're dealing with a block like this? Well, the best way I've found is to label each individual piece. Okay, so every single dimension, every piece that you're cutting gets its separate label. You put those labels in your cutting table. This is how I prefer to do it, but there's multiple ways, of course. I like to put just a column that's a label column, and every single individual cut you're giving it its individual label. You could do this A through Z. If you have less than 26 pieces, I have been in a situation where I've run out of alphabet before. There's some complicated blocks out there. You could also just put them in each individual kind of cut cell at the end in parentheses. I've seen that done as well. Another way you could do it would be to basically use the fabric letter and then the number. So A1, A2, B1, B2, etc. That works really well if you're making a lot of the same cuts from different fabrics. So, you know, a 2.5 inch by 5 inch rectangle of fabric A would be A1. And if you're making that same cut, a 2.5 by 5 inch rectangle for fabric B, it would be B1, and so the number corresponds to the dimensions while the letter corresponds to the fabric. That's also a really good way to do it. It just depends on what kind of block you're dealing with. But the beauty of this is that when you go to write the instructions, instead of referring to the dimensions, you refer to the label, and that's it. Okay? So if you're doing it kind of the traditional way where you're referring to dimensions, here's how kind of the first step of that block that I just showed you would read, right? You take 2 4-inch by 4-inch triangles, assuming you've already cut those squares into triangles in a previous step. You take those triangles of Acron fabric and attach them to the left and right sides of one 3.5 by 3.5 inch square of fabric. Like, are you asleep yet? This is awful to read. It doesn't flow at all. And there's a bunch of extra information that you really don't need in there because you've already cut the squares and triangles. You don't need to know those dimensions as you're working through the quilt pattern. You just need to know which square to take. That's it. So if you use labels for your pieces of fabric, here's how that would read. Very same steps. Take 2D triangles and attach them to the left and right sides of 1A square. Boom. That's it. How much easier is that to read? It's so much easier, right? And it gets you just enough information, the critical information you need to know to make the block, without all of this other stuff that you're ultimately just going to skim through. And every time you make your customer skim, they're likely to miss something important, which is not good, right? The other beauty of this is that you need about half as many words to say the same thing. And that's really good because it leads to a shorter pattern. If you've ever tried to reformat your pattern into like a paper booklet that you're going to get printed for selling in quilt shops, the real estate is really, really, really limited because the more pages you have, the more money it's going to cost them to get printed that you don't recover when you sell the pattern. So if you can shorten your steps and use less words, you have more space on the page and more real estate to work with in a paper pattern. And that is a very good thing. Now, obviously, you don't need to use this every time you write a quilt pattern. There are some that it's more necessary for than others. So, if you're doing an HST quilt and you're cutting the literal same size of squares out of 5 different fabrics, yeah, okay, you probably don't need to label those fabrics. That's going to be a little bit overkill. But if you've got like 5 or so different cuts of a couple of different fabrics, it's probably not necessary, but it certainly can't hurt. And if you've got like 7 or more, to me, it's required after that point, right? Because 7 different cuts of fabrics can start to get tricky, and anything over that, like, absolutely required, right? If you use it for, 3 or 5 cuts, yeah, it's probably not totally necessary, but it also doesn't really hurt. For me, every time I write patterns, I typically use this method because I typically tend to write complicated patterns. So even if I'm writing something simple, I will still label my fabrics just because that's what my customers are kind of used to. And then it makes my patterns feel more consistent for them anyways. So just get into the habit of using it and it will make writing your quilt patterns so much easier. It also minimizes the opportunity of you making a mistake when you refer to a dimension. So if in the cutting table it's 4 by 4 inches, and then you refer to it as 4.5 by 4.5 in the quilt pattern, that's going to confuse people. That's a typo. So if you're not referring to those dimensions at all, way less opportunity to make a mistake. And that's a really good thing. Alrighty, that's all I got for today's Tech Tip Tuesday. If you found this video helpful, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. See ya!